typo in the web server or PHP's configuration, the result of which is it just doesn't load properly. And voila, you try visiting a page on the internet and people see what's inside of your files. Now imagine this file is not something boring like lectures.php, but instead config.php, inside of which is your database usernames and passwords, your Amazon referral passwords, or anything that you're using inside of your website that's private is now public. So in short, we got to get that stuff outside of those directories. So let's see how we can do this. First, let me roll back these changes. Mod suphp. And over time, you'll likely get all the better at administering your own server by playing around with these things. So let's go now into version 5 of this. Now notice the difference. So in version 5, nothing is inside of this root directory. I have a README, which is meant to be documentation after today, if you want to play around with these. I have includes and templates still. But now, by convention, I created an HTML directory. I could have called it anything I want. Public HTML is often used when it's your private personal folders. When it's an actual full website, people usually say HTML or docs or htdocs. Doesn't matter. But the appliance assumes HTML. And inside of the HTML directory are only those files that are meant to be web accessible. So what's the implication here? Well, if I look at index.php, notice that the only thing I really have to change is this. I have to require a file that's in .. includes /helpers.php. But this is OK, because the web server is configured to only allow access now to everything below the HTML directory. And even though includes and templates live alongside of it, because they are no longer in the same directory, but alongside of it, you can now enforce at the web server level that nothing outside of HTML will be accessible. And now, in the worst case, if you screw up, you might expose what's in your HTML directory, but you're not going to accidentally expose the templates or the includes directory. And yet your own PHP code can still access it via .. or the like. So admittedly, you do have to tweak your web server configuration. And you, as an end user, cannot do this trick in your public HTML directory as easily if you want to isolate everything to the same folder. Just as an aside, the reason we didn't preach this in something like 50 is because if we want your accounts to be web accessible, you would have to put some files in public HTML, some files in your home directory. Then when you submit things, you get everything else that's in your home directory. So it's just messy. But we'll do it better in this class. So that's an improvement. But let's do one other thing here. So let's now actually start to implement this idea of MVC, the model view controller. We're going to do away with the model today. I'm not going to bother with a database, because we have very small data sets here in terms of lectures. But let's see if I can implement the idea of a controller. So now notice, just as I described in the story earlier, now I only have index.php. So this is the first attempt of mine at implementing the the V and the C in MVC. So I'm implementing my own sort of web architecture. Now this gets a little tedious over time, and so in the end, a lot of people do end up using frameworks, as we will for the first project. But let's see what's going on here. So first, I require some helpers. So there's some functions in there, not interesting just yet. But now notice this. Determine which page to render. So I have a little bit of logic at the top of index.php that's asking if a page HTTP parameter is set, go ahead and assign it to the page variable. Otherwise, just assume some hard-coded value, index by default. So in other words, if the user visits a URL of the form, let's say http example.com/page equals foo, I want to either remember foo in that variable or the default of index. Now, these are ugly URLs, but we can fix that later. So what do I do now? I have a switch that says, well, if the page in question is index, what do I want to render for the user? Well, let me first render the header, which is in the templates directory, and here's a dynamic title like we talked about before. Then render the index. And index, we'll see, is just a template really, but it just has the HTML tags for the home page. No header or footer, just that raw content. And then I'm going to go ahead and render the footer, and that's it. But oh, wait a minute, if the page is instead lecture, let me first check this. Did the user pass in a variable called n also? Because if so, I want to show the lecture template and pass in the variable n. In other words, if the user visited a URL that instead looked like this, lecture and n equals 1, ideally I want that to show me lecture 1's page or lecture 0's page or the lectures page. So we're parameterizing the URLs now. So if I want to do lectures down here, same idea, but I render the lectures template, all the while using that same render function that we wrote a little bit ago. So there's nothing else in HTML. It is perfectly isolated to just the controller. But if I go into includes, I still see helpers.php. And if I go into views, which you can think of for now as synonymous with what we called templates before, now I have index, lecture, and lectures. And just because header and footer are a little special, I put them in a subdirectory. Frankly, I don't really like this approach, but it's what CodeIgniter, a framework we'll use, does. So I borrowed their same approach. So notice the structure again is controller is in HTML, views are in views, and includes is just everything else that we might want to embody. So let's see the result. Let me go back to my appliance in Chrome. Let me go ahead and choose version. Let's see, this is version, where was I just now? 6. And by 8, you'll be amazed. Go into HTML, lectures, and it seems to be working. But notice the new URLs. You know, it's not the prettiest of things, but at least we've kind of started separating out our code functionality. As an aside, this is not normal. The fact that you can see HTML and includes and views and click on any one of these directories is a result of our being in a lecture environment and not in a production environment. If this were a production web server, we would cut off access to everything except HTML. All right, so this doesn't feel perfectly clean just yet. You know what's really bothering me? If only because I'm a little anal, those URLs are horrific, right? That's sort of like 2001 style URLs. We can do better than this. So what do URLs usually look like these days? For something like this, I feel like I'd like to see /lectures or /lecture/0 or the like. Now, there's actually some motivation for these, right? So search engines, for instance, typically will index URLs that look like actual file names much more effectively or at all than they do things that are just parameterized, right? You can have an infinite number of parameters, but really this is meant to represent one resource on the internet. So you really want the world and Google and Bing and the like to see URLs like that. So how do we actually support that? Well, because we now have full access to a web server, notice what I can do. In version 7, I pretty much have the exact same structure. If I go into my HTML directory, it looks like I have the same thing. But let me do an ls-a. Turns out I put an additional dot file, a hidden file that is called .htaccess. This is something that the A in LAMP uses. Apache is probably still the most popular web server software in the world. It's fairly high performing. It's perfectly free. And it's pretty much just omnipresent, though there are even faster solutions for certain types of workflows. But notice what I've done here. I've written these fairly arcane commands that, frankly, even I copy and paste or Google almost every time I try to write stuff like this. Rewrite engine on, so that means turn on something called the rewrite engine. Rewrite base just means what is the base URL in question. Unfortunately, this is necessary sometimes. But if you're making a real website that lives in the root directory, you don't even need that. And then the next 2 lines are fairly self-explanatory if you know regular expressions. We have here if the URL that the user has visited at this directory starts with lectures and ends with lectures. So remember, the caret symbol is the beginning of the string, $signs end of the string. What do I want to do? So if the user visits something /lectures, I want to actually rewrite that request secretly on the web server as going to index.php, page equals lectures. So the user is not going to see this. This is not a redirect in the 301 or 302 sense. This is secretly map this request to index.php on the local server. Similarly, if you see lecture /something, $, go ahead and a little presumptuously map that to index.php, page equals lecture, ampersand n equals $1. And the $1 means it means the variable. So it's a capturing. Whenever you use parentheses in regular expressions, it usually means you're capturing the value and storing it in numerically indexed numbers, $1, $2, $3, and so forth. So the end result here, even though the code base is identical, if I go into version 7 here and go up to my HTML directory, notice that not only do I get the beautiful base URL, which was a given, but now, wow, look how neat that is, right? And it works for lecture 1 and so forth. So anytime, every blog on the internet does this kind of trick these days, where you have these crazy long addresses, but that nonetheless map to some kinds of HTTP parameters on the inside. So this is a homegrown MVC solution. Let's end by looking at one that's sort of real world. So in the real world, there are a lot of frameworks that are meant to simplify or at least expedite the sort of process that we just went through. Because in fact, if we started using my homegrown MVC solution, we would very quickly start to realize, gee, I wish this function existed, or gee, I wish this function existed. And by functions, I mean things like form validation or error checking or a lot of the tedious stuff that you have to deal with any kind of web development. It'd be nice if someone handed that to me. So folks like CodeIgniter or Yi or Cake PHP or Symfony, or there's dozens of PHP and Python and Ruby frameworks out there. But among the simplest in the PHP world is this thing called CodeIgniter, which has both